Recent strikes put a spotlight on widening inequalities. And COSATU launches radical policy positions. How do we address the wage gaps as well as poverty?
I think social cohesion is under risk with current levels of both poverty and inequality.
Judge for yourself with Dennis Davis. Today at 5:30, only on the E! News channel.
Welcome back. Can I ask you, Bobby, because I know you wanted to talk about the future, so let's do that. Haroon Bhorat put a whole range of issues on the table. So let's try to take one by one. I mean, the issue of unemployment is a clear difficulty. Let's leave aside the fact that he's probably right that in relation to poverty questions, the government has done significant work on a whole range of issues. So how do we solve the problem?
Well, I'm sure it's the central social, economic and political challenge. What we need is employment-intensive growth. And I think we've got to apply our minds as to how we achieve that. I think there is a skills component, there's an education system component, there's a kind of anti-job mentality in the minds of many South Africans. We would prefer to employ machines at parking garages rather than people in movie houses, all over the place actually, and that is what we have to change together. I think it's a problem for Labour and government and business together. I don't really think it's the state versus the market. I think you need a smart state and markets that work for people.
But when you say that, then, so if you were fashioning a policy, what would be your 2 or 3 priorities that you would?
Well, I'd look for, in every possible way, employment creation incentives. I would look at using the tax system to this regard. I mean, actually, South Africa, over its history, has previously used the tax system to encourage capital-intensive growth. I would be thinking about writing off more than 1 times employment costs, at least for new jobs. I would look absolutely at young people and providing an incentive to get them across the line, across the factory fence, into their first job. I think the wage subsidy is one interesting idea, a youth wage is another, maybe, again, a tax incentive to get young people employed. But what we can't have is 3 to 4 million young people doing nothing in our society. That's a formula for disaster.
How do we get the 3 or 4 million people not doing nothing?
Well, our approach to employment...
Would you agree with what he's been saying?
I agree with some of the points that...
Tell me which ones you don't agree with.
I agree with the employment-intensive growth that we need to, because that's our approach as well. Saying that there are sectors that need to be targeted, sectors which have a greater labor absorptive capacity. We need to target those and incentivize those so that to promote employment. We are also calling for an employer of last resort, wherein we are saying that we need to expand the expanded public works program, make jobs there much more permanent and pay decent wages. So that's another angle of promoting and creating employment.
Do you accept that there's a productivity problem?
Well, I'm not quite convinced about the productivity problem. What is it that we're looking at when we say productivity in South Africa is low? Are we looking at the productivity? We compare productivity with labor cost. And how do we calculate labor cost and labor productivity? We're looking at labor productivity of productive workers. But when we calculate labor cost, we are just taking cost of the entire force in South Africa, of which some of it is not part of production cost. So looking at both labor productivity and labor cost, comparing the two ends and arguing that labor costs are too high relative to productivity.
But if you're going to
it's not a
grow through being an export-led economy, then surely that's a big concern.
Well, I think about being export-oriented, I think is ideological. It depends really which ideological predilection you subscribe to. I can argue for import substitution, industrialization.
Well, then we've got a whole debate about whether that's ever worked.
It's still a good...
I don't want to get into that. That's be another hour, and that's... Haroon, what do you say about some of the suggestions that Bobby Godsall's put on the table to deal with what is clearly a massive problem, unemployment?
Yeah, so I think, generally one can buy into and accept labor-intensive growth, the different labels, pro-poor growth, shared growth, and so on. For me, the one area of intervention which hasn't been mentioned thus far is around the informal sector. I mean, the one thing that is striking about South Africa as a middle-income country relative to Brazil, India, and many other middle-income countries, that we have a very, very small informal sector. And sitting astride this very small informal sector is in fact very high concentration levels in the South African economy. And I think that's one area where, say through state procurement, for example, one can look at ways of incentivizing and growing the informal economy, because that's your avenue. That's where the barriers to entry are fairly low to create large levels of employment. So for me, that's the one key thing. At the micro level, Bobby did mention it, there's this notion of wage subsidies. I think the other elements of state intervention, which poor and the unemployed, which can be utilized to encourage employment, is using the social grant system and introducing what are called conditionalities. So in other words, you will get the social grant conditional on, for example, undertaking some relevant training, or conditional on searching for employment. So the incentives one can build into already existing.
Why did the government then eschew? Why did the government eschew the Taylor report then? Why was the Taylor report rejected in relation to minimum income grants, minimum wage, income grants, sorry, wage?
Sure.
I mean, the Taylor report seemed to make. I mean, it could have been adapted to deal with what you're talking about.
No, well, the Taylor Commission wanted a basic income grant, a universal income grant.
But if you linked it to what you're talking about, what's wrong with that?
Child support grant is effectively going to be universal. So one could argue that the Taylor Commission, in fact, got what they asked for. This is a slightly different suggestion. You will get, it's a Brazilian model, actually. Yeah. You will get a grant conditional on you, in fact, entering a training program, for example, or conditional on you searching or showing that you're actually going to search for a job. That's a way to start getting young people or the unemployed perhaps closer to where the jobs are in terms of activities and perhaps in terms of their skill set.
But could I just ask this? I mean, if the government is intent on developing an export-based economic growth program, then productivity is clearly critical. And wages become critical.
Yes. So I think so productivity has got to be part of the story. I think, though, when one talks about an export-oriented industrial strategy, it goes to the core of industrial policy and the type of industrial policy you want. It also, in fact, ends up talking about the exchange rate. And do we think that the exchange rate policy to deal with the kind of export strategy we may have in mind?
Okay.
And as you've indicated, that's a debate for another point.
I know Bobby wants to raise a question. I'm going to let him do so, but I've got to take a short commercial break, as they say.
Taste the crisp, refreshing kiss of the SARS hob.
What is the show about?
What is the news without the crap? Next question.